Okay, I'm going to talk about the spring 2023 COVID vaccine booster campaign and the work that we did to compare the two vaccines that were being delivered during that campaign. We used OpenSAFELY. You're going to be seeing probably slides like this throughout the day, but I think it's worth emphasizing the value that OpenSAFELY brought to this study. So first of all, we used OpenSAFELY TPP. That contains almost half of the health records of people in England. It's got near real-time coverage, so we were able to answer the questions that we wanted to answer really quickly. And of course, it's not just the GP data, but there's extensive linkage to other sources of NHS data from hospitals and data about vaccines and who's being tested and so on, and death and so on. So we wouldn't have been able to do the study without the linkage from other sources as well. So just a bit of context, you can see here, so this is the number of vaccines delivered in England weekly since the start of the pandemic, or rather since the start of the vaccine availability. You can see the kind of initial splurge at the end of 2020 into 2021, and then it kind of settles into these regular patterns of booster campaigns in spring and autumn each year. And our study is the one that's highlighted in red here, so this sort of little bump in spring 2023. In that campaign, there were two vaccines available, the Pfizer vaccine and the Sanofi vaccine. And our study was essentially trying to figure out whether one was better than the other across a range of different outcomes. Two groups were eligible during the campaign, those aged 75 years and above, and people who were classed as clinically vulnerable. So that's if they're immunocompromised or have heart failure or chest problems and so on. And if you didn't fit into one of these groups, then it was most likely you weren't eligible for vaccination. So we took these groups separately and ran the studies in each of the groups as sort of two mutually exclusive groups. If you look at the numbers of people vaccinated during that campaign in those groups, with each of the two vaccines that were available, we're talking about millions of people within the OpenSAFELY TPP database. So 725,000 over 75s who received the Pfizer vaccine and almost 900,000 who received the Sanofi vaccine and so on. So there's huge numbers to work with here, huge numbers of people to make sure that we can use good methodology to get good answers to the questions that we're asking. And of course, what is the good methodology? How do you answer questions about effectiveness and safety when you're comparing two vaccines, when those vaccines weren't being allocated through randomization? We're just using observational data to try and understand whether one is better than the other. So what we did was matching. We took everybody who received a Pfizer vaccine and identified a very similar person who received a Sanofi vaccine and matched them together. And we did this across a range of characteristics: age, sex, various clinical conditions, date of vaccination, and so on and so on. And this gives us a sort of pool of people who are broadly similar on those characteristics. And if those who know about matching will know that it can be a problem. You throw lots of people away because you can't find a suitable match. So you can see in the graph here that the sort of softer colours are those people who were vaccinated who we couldn't find a match for, and the harder, sort of darker colours are those people where we could find a match. And we're throwing lots of people away. There's more than half of the available people for the study we didn't include in our final analysis. But that's okay. And the reason that's okay is because it gives us a population that is comparable. And I mean, you can't fully see it on this slide, but the sort of softer lines that emanate from the middle show that there are big differences before you do the matching. And once you've got a matched population, you get much sort of narrower, much closer differences between the two treatment groups. And that's not just on the characteristics that we matched, it's also on lots of other characteristics that we didn't explicitly match on. So we've got really good confidence that there's good comparability between the two groups. So just again, the numbers, you can see that we've sort of thrown more than half of the people away, but we're still talking about thousands and thousands of people. So you wouldn't really have been able to do this in other data sources where in smaller data sets. This type of analysis using this type of methodology is really only possible in resources like OpenSAFELY. So what did we find? We looked at COVID hospitalization, critical care admissions, COVID-19 related death, non-COVID death, and a couple of safety outcomes, pericarditis, myocarditis. And you can see, maybe almost see on this slide, that those who received Sanofi experienced slightly more COVID-related hospitalization events than those who received Pfizer, and that's true in the over 75s and in the clinically vulnerable group. Across the other outcomes, there aren't really any differences, and for the safety outcomes, pericarditis, myocarditis, there's really so few events that you can't make any sort of judgment about superiority at all, and that's a good thing. There were so few events, so few problems after vaccination with these vaccines that there was no way to tell whether one was safer than the other. In fact, it tells you that they're incredibly safe on these outcomes. This is the same information with incident ratios. That you can see some small differences in hospitalization, but not really any differences in other outcomes. And I'm not really interested here in talking about the differences. There's some evidence here that Pfizer was slightly better than Sanofi, but really the point of this talk is to demonstrate that these out-of-trial comparisons of vaccines are really, really important. When I say out-of-trial, I mean not assessed using randomized trials. The reason they're important is you can look at a much larger range of outcomes, much rarer outcomes that you wouldn't have the numbers to study in trials. You can look over longer periods of follow-up. You can look in much more diverse populations, those who are eligible, not just those who are eligible for trials or able to participate in trials, but anybody who receives the vaccine. And of course, you can look in new contexts in terms of the time periods where these vaccines are being delivered, where different variants might have been emerging and so on. And of course, it's not just the sort of scale of data that you have, it's the actual question that you're answering. It's unlikely that there's any vaccine manufacturers who are going to be directly comparing their vaccines with other vaccines. They usually compare vaccination versus non-vaccination. So doing the direct head-to-head comparisons in observational data is really important too. The question, which vaccine should we use, is as important as whether we should be vaccinating or not. And of course, if you've got these separate trials that you're looking at different vaccines, it's hard to do that, to robustly compare effectiveness across different studies rather than just doing a direct comparison in the same set of people. So this was work we did last year. We've done lots of other vaccine studies, and you're going to hear more about them in this session, but we've also got more work planned in the future. So this is the ECHO study. This is an NIHR-funded study, evaluation of COVID-19 vaccine histories using OpenSAFELY, and we're basically going to extend a lot of the analyses that we've previously done, extending them to future campaigns using a common protocol inspired by Venetia and Rachel's work using common protocols, which you'll hear about later. And we're additionally going to assess the impact of timing of vaccination and the spacing between successive doses, not just whether or not vaccination is effective or not. And there will also be a sort of series of reports that report on vaccine coverage, which is a big part of the early vaccine work that we did. This is the team. It's kind of evolved somewhat since then, since this slide was put together, but thank you very much for everyone involved. It was a big collaboration across Bennett, London School, University of Bristol, and also collaborators at Harvard in Boston as well. So thank you very much to everyone involved. That's me. Over to Andrea.